You're listening to Radio VR with me, Natasha Moriarty. Born in science fiction books and since then exhaustively imagined on screen, robots and artificial intelligence have long been a way of exploring our hopes and fears about technology. Yet, in real life, robots have been something of a disappointment. Reliable robots are hard to find, and even the most generous estimates rate their intelligence as about the same as a small bug. But many scientists think that's about to change. Exponential growth in the power of silicon chips, digital sensors, and high-bandwidth communications are changing what robots can do. And the field is the target of mammoth investment from some of the world's biggest companies, like Google and Amazon. But the rise of the robot poses troubling new questions. While we may benefit from robotic prowess as consumers, can we be confident that we'll benefit as workers? And there are still more serious concerns. Some scientists think that, in the future, robotic intelligence could plausibly eclipse our own. How do we ensure that these creations are benevolent at the same time as they are clever? Joining me for a discussion on artificial intelligence is Wendy Grossman, technology writer and founder of The Skeptic magazine, Dr. Kathleen Richardson, who is about to take up a post as Senior Research Fellow in the Ethics of Robotics at the Centre for Computing and Social Responsibility, Dr. Anders Sandberg from the Oxford Martin School at Oxford University. He works on the impacts of future technology. And over the phone we have Nick Bostrom. Nick is director of the Future of Humanity Institute and author of Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, Strategies. So I'll begin by asking all of you, how urgent is it that we start to address the ethics of robots? Kathleen, do you think our time as the most intelligent beings on the planet is limited if we carry on tinkering like this with robots?
This question is very interesting because people are reflecting on robotics and the ethics of robotics as a very separate kind of question. And when they do that, they actually are bringing into field, basically, issues that aren't really happening in robotics. So what they're speculating about is, well, if robots go in the military and they develop these autonomous capabilities, then they'll be able to make decisions by themselves. And therefore, before that technology even is present, we need to develop a framework, a structure to prevent that from happening. Yes, we do want to think about what kind of roles might robots play. Should they be playing roles in the more intimate realms of our lives? And a lot of the new developments in robotics has been, for example, to be companions or carers. And my work has looked at them as therapeutic agents for children with autism, for example. In those contexts, yes, absolutely, we want to be thinking of the ethics, but we don't want to be thinking of the ethics of the machine because the machine has no ethics. We want to be thinking about the human responsibility that goes into designing intelligent machines that we are then using to address our cultural and social problems.
What about you, Wendy? Do you think that the question is an urgent one? Are we on the cusp of great new developments in the robotic field?
I'm sort of divided because it's always very good to think about the impact of what you're doing at the beginning. On the other hand, we know from the internet that it's not very easy to predict exactly the direction that something is going to go in. And one of the problems with the internet is we've been fighting the same battles over the internet for more than 20 years because people keep trying to push old models onto something that works very differently. It's mostly, I think, yes, we should be thinking about these things. On the other hand, we do have a little bit of time. And the other thing is that people talk about technology as though it's some kind of unstoppable force. I mean, we are creating this. You know, we do have some say about whether we hire somebody to vacuum our carpets or do it ourselves or buy a Roomba. I mean, you know, there is not this sort of force that we can't counteract.
I suppose a lot of people are afraid of studies and developments going on behind the scenes that we can't even imagine and that might suddenly explode out into general society.
Cars are any big secret.
And actually, we tend to underestimate robotics because we only call it robotics when it doesn't really work. As soon as it works well enough, we just say, oh, that's automation. We don't notice that in many ways we have software robots working for us in our smartphones. A lot of our industry is based on a lot of automation, which is the robotics that works really well. And that is, of course, totally transforming our world in a lot of important and sometimes disturbing ways. So we might be obsessed about something that is moving around independently in the office building, but what's going on in the computer might actually be much more important.
Actually, one of the things I realized a couple of years ago when I wrote a paper about some of these things is that we're, as biological creatures, we're sort of movement obsessed. We think that anything that moves independently must be smart, and anything that is static and doesn't move must be stupid. And I think there's an obvious biological advantage to that, in that when if you go back to the agrarian early man, plants that didn't move and they couldn't hurt you unless you got close to them, whereas an animal might actually be chasing you and be a predator. So I can sort of see why we would regard with more alarm things that move around. But I think, what is it somebody said to me, that a washing machine has more intelligence in it than a Roomba? The kinds of automation right now that we should be worried about, Anders is right, are things that are making decisions about our lives behind the scenes, deciding whether we go on the terrorist watch list, or whether we get this loan or this medical treatment. The systems that are automated that we don't know anything about how they actually work underneath, and very few people understand the algorithms that drive them.
Strictly speaking, what is the difference in definition between a machine and a robot? I think we tend to assume that robots need to have a humanoid form, so arms, legs, and maybe some sort of face. Kathleen, how do you define robot?
The origin of the term robot comes from a Slavic term for worker. Means extra labour, to work slavishly. So the term itself, robot, comes from a fiction in the 1920s. And actually what was very interesting, even the term robotics comes from a fiction too. So fiction has really informed how we see robotics, which is why we have this humanoid idea. But the first robots weren't actually machines, they were human beings. And what happened in the 1920s is when the writer of the play, his name was Karel Čapek, wrote it and started circulating his play around Europe and around the world, other artists then took the robot character and turned it into a machine. So by the end of the 1930s, the robot has now become synonymous with machines. And once that starts to happen, then this kind of more widespread notion, it's almost like an othering practice. If you've got a robot that's basically an inert human being with no subjectivity, just performs on commands and instructions, once you kind of then turn it into a machine, you take away that original message that was kind of in the original play, which was really reflecting on the human condition, human society, how we were becoming like basically robbed of our subjectivity and automated through modern production.
Anders, would you agree with that definition?
From an engineering definition standpoint, a robot is simply a machine that senses its environment, uses the information it got based on that, and then makes some actions based on it. So that might be a piece of software, although normally we tend to think of it something moving around physically.
So from an engineering perspective, it's a reactive kind of machine. Nick, how urgent do you think it is that we tackle questions about the ethics of robots? Do you think that we're there yet? And do you think that we're anywhere near a point where we can have robots contributing to society in a widespread way?
I don't think that robots really is the concern. It's more the machine intelligence, which might be used to run robots, but it might also be used in a disembodied form, which in the nearer term has a lot of impact in society with the whole digital revolution and all the ways that big databases can be used. And in the longer term, I think, will be the thing that poses the real challenge and the real danger when we develop machines with the same kind of general intelligence that we humans have.
Could you explain the principle of singularity in that respect, where one day we might have a world where humans and robots have an equal level of intelligence?
The term singularity has been used in many different ways. I think the most interesting part of that is what I call the intelligence explosion. And this is the idea that when you reach a sufficient level of machine intelligence, and maybe we are still quite far away from that, then at some point this machine intelligence becomes able to participate in engineering even smarter machine intelligence. And increasingly this computer science research will be done by machine intelligence, at which point it looks like you might get a rapid feedback loop where you go from perhaps something roughly human level or slightly above human level to something radically super intelligent, perhaps within a very short period of time. And that then would form this transition from the era of biological intelligence to the era of machine intelligence, where machines are super intelligent and radically surpass us in not just the ability to perform calculations, but in the ability to innovate and create new technologies, the ability to plan, social skills, general wisdom.
So humans could lose control of the intelligence that they create almost. We shouldn't assume that just because it comes from us, it will always be slave to us.
Yes, if you think about what this would entail, if we actually did reach this point where we could create general machine intelligence that surpassed human intelligence, it would be an enormous deal. The reason why we humans are so special here on this planet is that we're a little bit smarter than the other great apes. I mean, they are stronger than us, the gorillas. There are a lot of animals that are faster and have sharper teeth and claws, and yet we are this dominant species on the planet. And the reason is just that our brains were slightly smarter than those of our great ape ancestors. And so for the same reasons, when machines eventually surpass us in general intelligence, they will be extremely powerful. And a lot then would hinge on exactly how we set up the initial conditions for this intelligence explosion, which is what I explore in this new book, Superintelligence.
I think it would be helpful if we just make sure they all have off switches.
I suppose if they were super intelligent, they could simply turn the switches back on again. Kathleen?
I don't think machines are ever going to outsmart human beings. First of all, it depends on how you model intelligence. It's very formulaic and mechanical. Most models of intelligence, robots and machines are very good at context-dependent things, which means that they can operate very well in an environment that is very rigid and structural and formalistic. Expect a robot or a machine to do anything spontaneous and it can't do it. And we know this from personal experience. You just have to go and buy something at your local supermarket and all hell breaks loose, because if 1 milliliter or something is on that weight, it goes into meltdown. The very fact that people are talking about machine intelligence obscures a lot of underlying issues. It is premised on a number of ideas about what they think human intelligence is, and it's often a very mechanical idea of human intelligence. This kind of idea of machines being intelligent rely on our concept of who we are and basically our subjectivity. It's not that the machines have become more intelligent, it's because people have become more mechanical. They become less spontaneous, more scripted in how they interact with people.
My favorite line about this is they promised us voice recognition and we got voice menus. Humans are incredibly adaptable. As the world becomes reformed to make it easier for machines to do things and decide things, we adapt to that. We become trained.
Yeah.
However, I think it's a risk of just looking at the narrow AI that solves a particular problem very well, but not very flexibly, and mixing that up with the possibility of general artificial intelligence, which is indeed a much tougher problem and much fewer people are seriously pursuing it. It's the general intelligence that could launch an intelligence explosion. But narrow AI could certainly change our society quite a lot by, for example, making certain skills much less valuable because they can now be done much more cheaply by machines.
AI did a kind of a rise in the 60s with this idea of building this artificial man. And within a couple of decades of just starting out, realised that these problems were really complex and they couldn't actually do what they aimed to achieve.
However, some of that has led to rather radical breakthrough. One of the classic problems traditional artificial intelligence totally failed at was machine translation. Google solved that using big data. You got a sudden transition when you moved to statistical machine learning, which was very surprising for linguists and experts of the field. Suddenly it turned out that sufficiently large databases actually look pretty smart. Not super smart by any means, but they're good enough to do certain things. I think we're going to get a lot more surprises like that.
And that's I think where the job thing that we started with, that's where that comes in, which is that a rough Google translation is good enough for many applications where perhaps you wouldn't have actually gone for a translation before. You would have just sort of thrown up your hands and said, well, I can't read that. But on the other hand, at the high end, in diplomacy, for example, you are not going to rely on Google's translator. You're going to get a human who with intimate knowledge of both languages, because the tiniest error could start a war.
So just going back to the connection between robots and jobs, I know that more optimistic people say that robots will eliminate drudgery and free up the human mind to invent new and creative projects. Which industries do you think will be hit first by advancing artificial intelligence?
Generally, it seems that everything that is routine and can be described rather crisply can be automated fairly easily. So that's why a lot of jobs where you know exactly what you're going to do all the day when you come into the office or your workplace, they can be automated. It's the jobs that require kind of manual creativity, hand-eye coordination, or the strategic intelligence, social intelligence, where you don't know what you will be doing during the day, that are much safer. So the gardener, registered nurse, and nuclear physicist and teacher, they're pretty safe. But somebody doing accounting, everything except that, hey, that number doesn't look right, could be automated.
I would agree with that. And also to say the military, if you go and look at like websites at MIT and you see these cute little robots, they look kind of like sweet little characters. If you read the kind of just below about who funds it, it will say DARPA, the defense agency. The defense agency, all these cute little robots that you see around the world, there's a lot of military applications that go into it. And what they're hoping to do is, by developing these ideas of responsive social robots, they want to draw on that so they can develop more sophisticated technologies.
I would just point out that DARPA also funded the beginnings of the internet and the beginnings
That's
of the computer, the entire computer thing. And
AI is completely linked with it.
Yeah, but I just mean that DARPA has funded some things that have brought us great benefits too. It's not purely...
Well, I believe in human ingenuity and that we can come up with these kinds of developments in our society without relying on the more destructive aspects of human applications.
Nick, do you have anything to add to that? Everybody says that robots are being used a lot in military technology. Can you picture a day when war is fought with armies made up entirely of machines?
Yeah, and I think that which ethical issues are dominant depends a little bit on time frame. The general intelligence that I was speaking of is still some time in the future, and the fact that our current systems are quite limited, I think, doesn't really give much evidence one way or another concerning the question of whether in the future we will have machines that will be generally intelligent. The whole area of military application is, I think, going to be one of significant ethical issues in robotics. But I think there it leads into wider ethical issues regarding the use of weapons to solve conflict. Many of the same ethical issues in warfare arise whether or not it's a drone doing the firing or a human fighter pilot. There are general issues as just war theory and when, if ever, it's right and to go to war. And I think that these questions of robotic warfare are perhaps best addressed in that more general context of ethics and war.
I suppose it feeds in as well to questions of if a robot can be said to be acting unethically, then who should be accountable for that decision? Should it be the robot? Should it be the person who commissioned the research into what robot could do? Should it be the person who actually manufactured the robot? Do you have an opinion on that, Nick?
What is important is that there is at least somebody who is responsible. Now, whether that's the general or the officer or the manufacturing firm, I think that has to be worked out in practice. But what we want to avoid is a situation where everybody can sort of pretend that it wasn't their fault and something bad happens and there's no butt to kick.
Anders, thank you. I think you wanted to say something.
I've been working a little bit on question of ethics for autonomous cars. And current autonomous cars don't think morally. They just act according to fairly simple programs. However, it's not inconceivable that they will sooner or later, perhaps by sheer accident, end up in a situation where we would find a human driver acting in a morally praiseworthy or blameworthy way. Which leads to this annoying question for the engineers. What do you put into the car software? What kind of rules should you have? If the car is going to run into a couple of people, does it swerve and hit just one person? Or does it try to sacrifice itself and its passengers? And different people might answer quite differently to this. My own personal answer is we ideally want the car to behave like the driver or owner of the car would have done. So ideally, when you enter the car, you put in whether it should be acting utilitarian or according to some deontology. It's pretty unlikely that that's going to happen. Most likely some lawyers and committees are going to decide for us the ethics of cars. But I think Nick is right. It's very important to make sure that somebody is responsible. At the point where the machines can become morally responsible, well, then they got other problems too.
The thing is that for many, many years, the software industry has completely disclaimed all liability for the workings of their products. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest problems in if people want seriously to deploy self-driving cars. Google, who's been doing a lot of work on this stuff, they don't want liability. I've been told by a friend who attended the hearings in Sacramento over the law that made it possible for these cars to drive on the public roads in California, that this was one of the big stumbling blocks, was that nobody wanted to take liability. You know, the driver is driving the car, but he's not driving the car. The auto manufacturers say, well, we didn't really make cars so that they could be driven by software. And the software people say, no, we never have liability. So, you know, I think that's actually going to be a big thing. And the insurance industry may be the thing that ends up being the arbiter.
Do you think that could be holding back some research and some developments, the fact that nobody wants to be accountable if they unleash something that turns out to result in deaths? Or
nothing seems to be holding back research, but I think that'll be the stumbling block for their being deployed in mass numbers, certainly, because it's going to be something that legislatures are very aware of when they start writing laws.
It's also a big difference between Google, who sees a lot of cars out there as robots without software, and the car industry, who thinks that, oh, we make cars, we're not making robots, we want to enhance the driver instead. They're thinking about the problem from totally different ways.
Something to add there, I mean, the environments where robots are most effective, like factories, are basically machines, and the environment is built around the robots. Now, that means the environment itself is very rigid and structured. The human environment is very unpredictable. We're a long way off before we're going to see self-driving cars actually working. The car is moving autonomously and it does have sensors, but it's able to work because the environment as well is supporting its activities. So you couldn't actually put a self-driving car out on the street and just tell it to go around the block. It just wouldn't do it, just crash.
What about the Google cars driving around Mountain View? They're certainly going around the block.
But they are in these very structured environments.
They've driven hundreds of thousands of miles.
They have, yes, in deserts.
No, this is in the suburbs in Silicon Valley.
Yes, in the suburbs of Silicon Valley, and the environment is all mapped out and put into that machine. It's not spontaneously...
are they having to deal with other cars on the road
Yes.
and react spontaneously to that?
There are sensors, but it's still a very... I mean, you just could not put a Are you saying you could put a self-driving car in the middle of central London?
I don't know about central London,
Yeah.
but there was one driving past me on the highway.
On the highway
On the
coming
highway.
here? Nobody was
on the
driving
highway
a car.
in Mountain View, California.
I mean, California drivers are not as predictable as all that, you know. I think you are underestimating what those cars have gotten up to by now.
I think I'm kind of overestimating human beings by saying that they are spontaneous and they react spontaneously to their environments.
I do agree with that.
However, it's worth noting that quite a lot of software does spontaneous things that we don't like. Any program will tell you that it's extremely hard to predict what software is doing. And it's possible, of course, to make software that learns and updates. We would say it's still not as flexible as humans, and it doesn't have a rich internal world of intentions. But it can still be quite unpredictable. My favorite area is, of course, neural networks, where we take a lot of data and train something to recognize things. So recently there have been a bit of a revolution in using deep learning, where you use supercomputers and large data sets to train things. And it turns out that if you use the Google image database, you get spontaneous representation of inside of important concepts like human, cats and tools angled 30 degrees, because that's what a lot of pictures of the internet are. And the interesting thing is that sometimes you can use this kind of system to ask them questions like, what color should this picture of a bathroom be? And it concludes it should probably be blue, because most bathrooms are blue. Nobody programmed that fact into it. It just emerged rather organically from the data. Another problem is, of course, sometimes it misbehaves spontaneous. We had the flash crash a few years back when various trading agents suddenly misbehaved and crashed the American stock market over about 30 seconds. And on the Amazon marketplace, some trading agents are sometimes housing up the prices of books to stratospheric levels because we're looking at each other.
One thing that I think also is that sometimes machines seem unpredictable because we don't sense what they do. For example, a robot with a temperature sensor might be able to react to a change of a quarter of a degree in the temperature, and it might kick something into a different mode or something, whereas the human wouldn't sense that. So to you, it would appear as though the machine was unpredictable when in fact it was behaving exactly as it was programmed to do.
I want to see these Google cars driving autonomously because as I've been in many, many robotics lab and watched robots in action, they break down all the time. Getting them to do a simple action like going along a corridor, opening a door, is absolutely hugely complex. What often is relied on is videotape and footage of robots working, which means there's a highly stylized presentation of what robots can do, often presented by robotic agencies. The moment I see a self-driving car, I'd love to see it. But I think, come back to this question, I think the very fact that we're having this conversation shows how degraded our view of humanity has become, that we can think about a machine, an algorithm going wrong, and think that it might be a creative and innovative aspect, and that it's doing something and we're responding to it. I mean, it just shows a complete confusion to me about what it means to be human.
Nick, do you have anything to counter that with?
Well, I guess if we want to see the self-driving cars, you'd have to travel to Mountain View, California, and have a look.
Nick, are we underestimating what robots can do here a bit?
No, I think we are probably more often overestimating it than underestimating it, for basically the reasons that you mentioned, that there's like commercial incentives to try to put the best face on how well a given system works. And also, if you're an academic building a robot, you want to sort of pretend that it works better than it does, so you get more funding. So in terms of current capabilities, I don't know that we are, in general, prone to underestimating them. But what we might be doing is underestimating the ultimate potential with continuous development in these areas and the development of more powerful general learning algorithms for where this will eventually go. So that's where the big concern is. One has to differentiate the question of what is possible in the sense of what can we do now, and what is possible in the sense of what will we be able to achieve when we figure out in general how cognition works.
You said the process of superintelligence coming about could happen quite quickly when there's a rapid feedback loop. Do you think that we could be working on this steadily and then very suddenly a new development could take us by surprise and a robot would be able to do far more than we ever intended very quickly?
It's not that you will have these robots with machine guns and that they're going to take over the world. You will have robots with machine guns, but they're going to just be integrated as part of militaries. But where you have a danger of a kind of machine intelligence revolution deposing humans as the sort of top life form on this planet would be when you have the general intelligence part that can then scheme and create new intelligence and new technology. And then it doesn't matter whether it starts out with machine guns or without machine guns. If you are a very, very intelligent agent, you can find ways to achieve your goals, even if your initial means are very limited.
Do you think it's likely that superintelligence could have benevolent aims?
That depends on how it is treated. So in principle, it's certainly possible to imagine that this intelligence explosion would be the best thing that ever happened. It just, at the present, looks like it will be an extremely difficult problem, this control problem of trying to set things up so that you could somehow have a controlled detonation when this intelligence explosion goes off to control the outcome of what the superintelligence would do. Looks like it's in principle possible, but in practice, a fiendishly hard problem. And I think where the real urgency is actually in getting some of the brightest minds of our generation to work on this control problem for this hypothetical future technology that does not yet exist. Because if and when it does come into existence, we already at that point have to have solved this very difficult control problem.
Wendy, I know that Elon Musk, the US billionaire, has said that robots are more dangerous than nukes, potentially. Do you fear robots and what they might be able to do?
No,
by robots, I mean artificial intelligence, superintelligence.
I'm a pretty pragmatic person, and we have nukes now. So I think I'm more afraid of the thing we have now.
Kathleen, I know that you do a lot of work on robots offering therapeutic assistance. In that, can robots be better than humans?
Well, that's very interesting because, once again, there is this idea that robots can help children with autism, for instance. So, and what normally happens is a robot will be in the presence of a child with autism and a therapist. But they're actually trying to develop the technology in directions where actually you don't need a therapist present, that the robot itself can start doing the therapeutic diagnosis Now, once we start getting onto a kind of robot diagnosing and assigning it authority to do that, I think that raises some really interesting ethical questions for me. But I want to say as well, I do think there is a way to create really good machines and robots, and that is to really sort out what is human and what is not human, and then think about the ways in which humans actually really do influence and create technologies. So anthropologists have been wonderful in showing how cultural ideas go into making machines. So people in labs, they think they're creating these neutral entities, but they're creating gendered models of normative models of gender, class, race. They're doing all those kind of things. And what anthropology can do is it can actually ask the scientists to think about what other ideas are going into their practices. And I think once they can learn how to do that more consciously, then they can really they can start to make machines that are really just about creating that machine, not just about extending human culture into machines.
Anders, I know that in the film Her, there's a sexual relationship at the centre between a man and an operating system. And I think that we're continually asking ourselves, could you call a machine or an artificial intelligence a friend? Could you have a plausible human relationship with them? Do you think that that's something that can happen and that one day might replace the need for human interaction altogether?
Well, humans seem to be pretty good at kind of imputing a sense of agency, a sense of personness on a lot of things, but just pretend in the right way. Just think about dolls or the chatbots like the classic psychologist program Eliza. Even if you know exactly how Eliza works, and it's a really simple trick of reflecting your text back at you, sometimes you get drawn into psychological discussions with this piece, which is more stupid than a wall. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that some people would actually really like to have a robotic partner, even if it was very simple. You can imagine a spectrum running from something like a chatbot that just looks sexy enough, over to something that responds with simulated emotion with some detail, over to something that might be complex enough that we might actually start thinking maybe there is actually something there. I think it's going to be tough because we humans are very discerning when it comes to social cues. The reason Microsoft's paperclip in the office was such a disaster back in the 90s was that it was interrupting people. It was saying, hey, you want to write a mail? Do you want help?
Yeah.
And I didn't want help. I got deeply annoyed every time they'd pop up, and they didn't even understand that I was annoyed. So making something like the operating system in Her that figures out when you're annoyed, when you're happy and so on, that takes a fair bit of sophisticated programming. We're not there yet. I think it's going to be very tough to automate. But were we to ever get social intelligence enough into our system, I think we would probably say, wow, this is finally the way to really mend our hearts. And maybe from a humanistic perspective, we might say we're losing out to something, but it might be really addictive.
Here is my version of this future. What happens is they'll invent this, but it'll be a subscription service. And if you ever decide not to pay the subscription anymore, the thing will seem to stop loving you.
Oh, that's beautifully evil.
Yeah, and that will break your heart.
Absolutely. Well, it won't break my heart because I'm not going to turn one of these things on. I don't like being talked to by machines. But
do you think? Do you think that because we project so much onto machines and blank spaces, then really people might end up thinking that they're having a relationship with an operating system or whatever, but in fact it's just themselves?
Well, the thing that was so unreal about that movie was that the way the world is constructed now, when Samantha went off, she would have been seamlessly replaced by a backup, and he would never have known she was gone.
So technology could give us all the emotional nourishment that a human relationship can, but at the same time be so sophisticated that we never need to feel heartbreak, because even if this virtual intelligence goes off us, it can be seamlessly replaced with another one with the same voice, the same personality, the same everything. I wonder if that would change the human condition, and maybe it would be more authentic to have this software able to reject us. Kathleen, do you think robots could ever replace human love?
Humans need love, they need companionship, they need attachment. And we think about the areas in which these tools are being marketed for. They're people who are experiencing attachment difficulties. So the elderly who aren't in the situations where they can form new structural relationships through work, the adult men who aren't able to form relationships. These sex dolls are being developed to support them. And then children with autism. These are all attachment difficulties, right, where these robots are being targeted for. And I think what we really need to ask is, why are we proposing to use machines to help our communities who may have these attachment wounds and attachment difficulties, rather than human beings helping them themselves? I think that's the real issue, actually. We can't just throw a machine at the elderly or some adult male. We need to find out what's wrong and why, how can we help them to form better relationships with other human beings.
Okay, Nick, is there anything necessarily superior in a relationship with another human being than with a very intelligent form of artificial intelligence?
I mean, if we imagine it actually with the kinds of intelligent systems that exist today or could be built in the near future, then it's a very different thing, because there is then not a genuine two-sided understanding of each other. If we imagine it more as a philosophical thought experiment, or you had a machine, let us take the extreme case where they were actually qualitatively identical to a person with the same inner life. It's just that they were digital rather than flesh. Then in that situation, it seems to me it would be perfectly possible to have a fully meaningful relationship with this digital mind. And that, to sort of reject that, would be a little bit akin to a racist attitude, because you would be fixating on what is ultimately a relatively superficial characteristic.
No, it's true. The more attention I pay to robotics, the more I feel like a biological supremacist.
Maybe that would have to be rethought a little bit in a world where there actually existed digital minds with the same depth of inner experience as biological minds have now. We might need to maybe question that big ontological distinction. But it would be a big mistake to infer from that therefore these current robots or AI programs that we have, or we can foresee in the next 10 years, that they would somehow be a full good substitute for a real human, because at the moment we think there is nothing on the inside at all, and that would be the big difference.
So when asked about what jobs are fairly safe from automation, I quite often quip that, of course, priests, politicians and prostitutes, they're pretty likely to survive fairly well. And part of that is, of course, that we want to have a human in that position. In the case of a priest, presumably because we imagine that a priest must have a soul or something like that in order to do his job. In the case of politician, it's because of representativeness. He or she is supposed to represent us. And in the case of prostitutes, there is something about the emotional connection. And doing that is quite tricky. And currently, we're good at routine tasks when things don't change. That's something that can be engineered into a system. As soon as you need social intelligence or creativity or strategic intelligence, current systems are really bad. And they're probably going to remain that for the foreseeable future. But that doesn't mean we can be complacent, because sometimes we get surprises, like the autonomous cars that went from something that was very, very ineffective and could only work in deserts over to something that is actually driving around Mountain View in just a few short years.
Still looking forward to what might be possible. Can anyone envisage a time when society is divided between those who can afford this technology, so people who can afford to have a robot clean their house and to get into a self-driving car, and who can maybe even afford to have a relationship with an artificially intelligent creature, and those who can't? Do you think that might be a new form of division, with an underclass who can't get access to technology?
I think it would not be new. Right now, some people can afford to have a housekeeper and some can't. And if a robot house cleaner gets to be cheaper than a human one, then the number of people who could afford one would increase. But presumably there would still be a lot of people who couldn't afford one. But it wouldn't be anything new about that, as far as I can see.
What I would hope is, you were Kathleen, you were talking about children with autism. What I was hoping was that you were going to say that there were moves to create robots that can do actual therapy, because one of the problems with children with autism is that they require so much in the way of help, and very few parents can really afford all the range of assistance they need.
Well, that is one of the marketing strategies of some of these companies.
Anyway.
Yeah,
It doesn't mean it can work, though, because I think one of the reasons you need so much intensive help is you need humans who understand what's going on.
I'm happy for robots, a bit like puppets, that they can be therapeutic and they can be enjoyable for a child. In fact, I do lots of work with young children in schools, and they love robots. They can be, they're wonderful in that respect. But at the same time, I don't think we can outsource caring for our children with autism to machines. We have to take responsibility for our human relationships, and that means our communities that are disenfranchised and lonely and ill and disabled and all those things.
Automation tends to make certain things cheaper. So I quite often argue that we almost have a moral duty to try to automate as much as possible of medicine, simply because healthcare is something we want to make really cheap so as many people as possible can get it. It's just that automating all of medicine is super hard, because that involves some parts of human care and creativity and strategic intelligence that are very hard to build into it. But I generally think that a world where you have really good automation is going to be a fairly rich world. So if you have inequalities, that's mostly because humans are not distributing the resources very fairly. It's not going to be because there are not enough resources to go around.
But it's interesting, the idea of in supermarkets now, in the post office, in the bank, there's all these automated systems. But I don't know how many encounters you've had with these machines and they've actually worked. Because if it wasn't for that human being there who's actually doing the role of 3 people now, manning all those, supporting all those tills, that is basically what's going on. And basically, human beings are becoming caretakers to these basically dysfunctional machines.
Actually, I think the class division is going to be who can afford personal service and who can't. I mean, I personally pay a little bit more to shop around the corner from the family I like, who own a nice shop and are very accommodating, rather than the Tesco Express with the automated checkout points. And I think we're going to see that through society. The people who can afford human lawyers will hire human lawyers, and the ones who can't will, just as years ago in the States, you had people hiring H&R Block to do automated tax preparation for them when the people who really, could afford it paid an accountant.
Well, that's a very nice note to end it on, and sadly that's all we've got time for today. But speaking then was Wendy Grossman, and I was also joined in the studio by Dr. Kathleen Richardson and Dr. Anders Sandberg, and over the phone by Nick Bostrom. I'm Natasha Moriarty, and you were listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London.